I speak to you in the name of the one holy and living God.
Amen.
Please sit. Wow. Welcome home. Wow. It is such a moment to see you here. Such a gift. Such a moment filled with hope. It's been 51 Sundays since last we gathered for public worship. 51 weeks expelled from our temple, removed from our restaurants, relieved of many of our pleasures, banished to our homes. And we're the ones, most of us, who count ourselves fortunate. So many others find themselves in this time of exile, losing their jobs, their homes, their lives. Enslaved by an insidious virus that poses like eggs in a basket, today is a turning point in our journey. Much like the Israelites in this morning's Hebrew Testament text, we are being led out of Egypt, out of the reach of the COVID-19 virus, into the wilderness where we will either find or lose ourselves while we wander between the way things used to be and the promised land. I read the text, the Hebrew text, and I think, poor Moses. After all the plagues that he handled in order to lead those Israelites out of Egypt, bloody water, frogs, lice, boils, hail, locust. I mean, what kind of pandemics were those? Instead of being grateful for their newfound freedom, the people become impatient. They complain about the miserable food. They can't go out to their favorite restaurants. Who wants manna anyway? We want meat. They speak against Moses and against God. The poisonous serpents of faithlessness and unconscionable complaining corrupt the hearts and minds of the people Israel as they swallow the poison of their own protesting. You know, we all know how this scenario plays out. Someone whines and grumbles about the way things are. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a friend. And pretty soon a chorus gathers around that complaint. You've been there. Social media gets wind of it and boom, strikes a match. And in a timeless second, protest is roaring with people swallowing their own poison and dying in the wilderness, dying by their own hands. This is the story of Moses and the moaning Israelites. This is the story of the fickle crowds in Jerusalem demanding, crucify him on that fateful day for Jesus. And this is the story in our country today, with volleys of revolts erupting from the extreme right and flaring back from the far left. It's as if we're standing in a pit of poisonous snakes, and we're split into feverish corners until a crowd is bent on an arc toward destruction. No good can come of this. And so from a 10,000 feet above the ground perspective, what happens is we look down and we can no longer distinguish one group from the other. Why? Because we are all pointing poisoned fingers and looking for someone to blame. Altogether, we become a company of voices speaking out against God and our leaders. And although we do not deserve it, still we are not condemned. All is not lost. To see what that means, we can go back to the Hebrew text, turn our attention to Moses. And with Moses, we discover a way out of this hopeless hostility. praying on behalf of the Israelites, Moses first looks to God and then offers the snaky masses something new to look at, something new. Lifting up that bronze serpent, Moses invites the cranky crowd to turn their eyes to the healing rather than complaining and yearning for yesterday. I believe this was the first time recorded anyway, that the image of a serpent entwined around a pole, it may have been in earlier mythology. I think it's the first recording of this aspect of humanity's imagination. You see, the Israelites are stuck between Egypt and the Promised Land, and they're looking backward. They're looking backward to the way things used to be. That is until Moses gives them something new to look at. And this image of a serpent wrapped around a pole came to be identified with the god Asclepius. It's a Greek god of healing and medicine. And today we see it as a symbol associated with the World Health Organization and the American Medical Association, and on the side of ambulances. Right? You're all familiar with this sign. So what does this perennial symbol have to say to us today? I believe it invites us to turn our eyes and give our attention to healing rather than complaining and yearning for the way things used to be. 400 years after Moses, Jesus is still trying to get God's people to stop protesting and to see and believe in something new. And much like Moses lifting the serpent in the wilderness, Jesus offers himself to be lifted up as something new to look at and to believe. I can almost hear this duet, Moses and Jesus pleading, people, don't you see? If you choose to look at the bronze serpent instead of your miserable food and your thirst for the promised land, if you choose to look at Jesus walking through suffering in the company of God, you are choosing life. You are healed. But you must choose to believe. Dear people of God, what do we choose to look at? What do we choose to believe? Do we shift our eyes to the poisonous snakes and join our voices to the complaining crowds yearning for the way things used to be? Do we choose to be a bunch of stiff-necked people speaking against God and our leaders? We're social beings. And here we are in the 21st century, and no matter what, we can find something to protest about. We're really good at that. We can protest about our rights with regard to economics and social status and culture and civility and politics. We can whip ourselves up into frenzies, point our fingers like venomous snakes at one another, looking for something or someone to blame. Or we can look at something new rising in the midst of our wilderness journey between the idealized things that used to be and the promised land. And let us not forget that those Israelites were slaves in Egypt before Moses led them into the wilderness. Why did they want to go back there? Likewise, when we remove our personal or individual or collective rose-colored glasses, we must confess our past is not pristine. Do we really want to be slaves to the way things used to be? Here's the thing. Poisonous protests rise on both sides of the aisle and sing every note on the scale. Since the beginning of the beginning, this is our story. Do we really want to continue suffering in the poison of our own protests? Do we really want to choose death and listen to ourselves speaking out against God and leaders and Moses and crying, crucify him, crucify her? How many hundreds or thousands of years before we choose to look at something new rising up somewhere between the way things used to be and the promised land? People, this is where we stand today. This is a turning point in our journey. We are being led out of Egypt. We're being led out of reach of COVID-19 into a wilderness where we will either find or lose ourselves while wandering between the way things used to be and the promised land. More than 2,400 years have passed since Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. 2,000 years have passed since Jesus is risen with the promise of new and renewed life. Don't you think it's time for us to open our eyes and see something new and choose to believe? Dear people of God, this is a matter of life or death. Do you believe? Amen. This week, our action aimed at what is right, our call to action, is to help with a project that our artist, Nicotera Texiera, the artist who did the work that's on the Migrants' Way of the Cross, to help with a ministry that she's doing for Casas Alitas. The children of the families there are all given a bag, an activity bag, which they take on the bus with them when they are going to their sponsoring family. Often they're on the bus for many, many, many hours, and this is to give them something to do. So Nick has been, making these activity bags with her own resources for quite a while now, and she's asked if the church would help her. So art supplies, coloring books, little story books in Spanish, Spanish and English. Many of the children are Spanish speaking. That would be most helpful. So that is our action aimed at what is right this year, this month.